Hey YouTube, Alex Conley here, and in today's video, I'm coming to you from Medellin, Colombia, and I've got kind of a phrase that I've thought about, and I've heard it from other travelers before. Certainly, I didn't invent this phrase, but I want to talk about why I think you should bring twice the money and half the stuff. And I know that this might seem a little redundant, that travel costs money and that you've got to plan for expenses, but I'm going to mention just like kind of my reasoning as to why I think this is a good plan to have. So the first one is that lugging a ton of stuff around is not fun. It may seem practical for long-term travel, but your plans may change. And I want to provide an example of this. So my thought was when I came here to Medellin that I'd be able to set up in this nice hotel and basically stay in the same place for like a month. And so I brought a couple of keyboards, and I also brought a Mac Mini. And I thought that, oh, well, the television's going to be good enough for me to connect my Mac Mini to it. For those who don't know, a Mac Mini is sort of like a desktop Mac, except that it doesn't have there's no attached screen, so basically you've got to connect it to some kind of monitor, which is fine for me at home. I have a nice monitor at home, but obviously I can't bring a monitor with me along with everything else I need to take with me, so the monitor stays at home. But I thought, well, these keyboards will work great, but in the time that I've been here, I've hardly used the keyboards just because it's been difficult to find the proper workspace here in Medellin. And so I find that in this instance, I wish I hadn't brought two keyboards. I wish that I had brought like one keyboard and not assumed that my first accommodation would be ideal. Now, I don't mean to complain at all. I'm really overall enjoying my time here. I think it's a really interesting city. But it's worth mentioning that you might struggle as far as like being able to use all the things to do what you thought you were going to do. So continuing on that subject, to my next point, money will often be more useful than stuff, and there are a couple of exceptions to that. I'll mention those exceptions now. You can get basically, a lot of what you need, but you need to keep in mind if you have a specific medical condition that requires specific medication, I would not count on being able to get that abroad. I would not be able to count on getting it at in a short amount of time. Let's say you've got a really important medication that you can't afford to run out of, and you run out of the medication. It's not like the U.S. or perhaps Europe where maybe there's some kind of emergency fail-safe system where you're still able to get your medication. The other exceptions would be frequently used kind of like pricey, expensive consumer goods. So as an example, your iPad, your cell phone, your laptop, a lot of these types of things are going to be cheaper to get in your home country. And it's not going to, let's say you're in a given country and they have a 100% value added tax. You're not going to necessarily want to pay double for a certain item just because you happen to have the cash for the item. And in some cases, it's going to be more convenient to bring it from your home country because it's not just the cost, it's also getting the device set up. You're hoping you didn't just buy, the local version, the version that isn't in your home country's language, or it's maybe challenging to change the language over, this type of situation. It's not just the higher price that you're concerned about paying, it's that the time, it's the cost of time and your time in getting a device set up and to your specifications, testing different pieces of, say, third-party software, third-party hardware, making sure all of these things are good and working. So now that I've discussed the two exceptions, what I mean by money will often be more useful than stuff. Well, as an example, I'd rather, travel with one tube of toothpaste and replenish that once every month or two than to travel with, say, half a dozen tubes of toothpaste, and now I'm having to carry that around. So that's one thing to think about with cash is like you don't want to bring everything that you're going to need for the entire duration of your trip. If you're traveling for a long time, it's just not convenient to have to carry all those things. The exception I make, of course, is deodorant. I find it really difficult to find the deodorant that I enjoy the most in other countries. But aside from that, I can find, fine toothpaste, fine shampoo. All these types of things are a non-issue when I'm abroad. Something else to consider that came up in the first time that I traveled abroad. I was overhearing a guy talking to someone else on the plane. We were flying from Bangkok to Chiang Mai. This was, I think, 3 years ago. And he was mentioning one of the things that he tries to do is limit himself to one bag. And he said, and this is something I overheard in the discussion, he described that, well, it costs me 30, 40, in some cases $50 to check a bag between countries, depending on which airline I use, and the budget airlines are known to charge higher bag fees. So if I limit to one bag, all of a sudden that cuts down my cost. Let's say I visit I fly 10 different times. Maybe that's, $300, $400, $500 that I'm saving. So that's something that where you might think, well, I'll bring extra stuff because then I won't have to buy it while I'm there. I won't have to worry about tracking it down while I'm there. Well, in some cases, if you bring something you don't end up using very much or at all, you're spending more money to haul that thing around you don't use than you would have been to just compress your stuff, carry fewer things. In my case, I should have just brought one keyboard. I don't know what I was thinking bringing two, but needless to say, I may end up giving one away or selling one at a certain point in my trip just because I don't see myself using both keyboards over the course of the next few months. I may be gone as long as up to 6 months from now, which I definitely don't want to carry the thing for 6 months, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Maybe I'll hit a sweet spot where it comes into play, but that's just something to consider, is that like when you're bringing a lot of stuff, you're not just worried about the cost of transporting these goods, but you're also worried, what if something gets, taken or stolen? Like, it's much harder to keep track of multiple backpacks than just one backpack. I've noticed already, like, I brought, I think, 3 bags on this trip, whereas my Asia trip, I just brought 1. And here it's, like, exponentially more difficult to keep track of all this stuff. And so even now I'm thinking about paring down and selling a few of my things and just buying them back when I get back to the United States. It's just kind of up in the air. But if I had brought half the stuff, if I had made an effort to compress what I needed to take with me, then that might have been a non-issue. That might have been something that I wouldn't have had to think about. Something else about bringing extra money that I think is worthwhile thinking about, if you're coming from a Western country, which I'm going to guess you are if English is your first language like mine is, then you may end up paying you will end up paying a higher price for your Western food than you will for your local food. So things like pizza and hamburgers, they're not necessarily super, super expensive in other countries. It's just that they don't seem to be that much cheaper than food in your home country. If you're somebody that really likes street food, definitely you'll save money in many cases. But when it comes to actual Western food, you're sitting down for a steak, or you're sitting down for even non-Western food, just like imported food. Like if you like sushi, it's not going to necessarily be pennies on the dollar. You're probably still going to pay more than what you'd pay for local cuisine for sushi. Even in Japan, there's this idea that in Japan, Japanese people eat sushi every single day for every meal, and that's not the case at all. In fact, many middle-class Japanese people will eat sushi maybe like once a month or maybe once every couple months. It's not something that is relatively affordable. Now, there are some places in Japan that cater to more of a fast food audience. As those places, you are going to see a little bit more frequent attendance by people. But even then, that's not necessarily something that people think of when they think of cheap street food. So that's something to consider too, is it's not just Western food. Let's say you really like Indian food. I'm part Indian. I really like Indian food. I don't expect to pay much less for Indian food outside of India. I haven't been to India yet, but I don't expect to pay much less for Indian food outside of Western countries. Like I ordered some Indian food here in Medellin like a week or two ago, and the total was the equivalent of, I think, 16 US after fee and tip. And that's not, absurdly expensive. I got like a dish and some samosas. Like, well, I know some people in India would probably say that's absurdly expensive, but as far as, in my mind, like I've eaten Indian food in a lot of different places, and that's like standard price. And so that's something to consider. Like, you might think, well, if I'm in this other country, I can try all these different foods, international cuisines, imported ingredients for pennies on the dollar. Yes, many of these meals will be somewhat cheaper, but they're not going to be drastically cheaper. Like for the $16 meal, if I got the same thing where I'm from, the US, I might have paid $20. So I might have paid like 25% more, which isn't that much more when you're talking about that amount of money. So that's something to consider is like, if you're not eating local food, you're probably not going to be paying local prices. So a few other things too, as far as like how extra money can help when it comes to spending in general. You may be impressed by the quality of what you get for per dollar spent, causing you to spend more. So Japan, once again, I like to brag on Japan, just because it was a really positive experience and it met my expectations. And I feel like when it met my expectations, like I knew kind of what I was getting. And not necessarily in a bad way, but a lot of places either they like fail my expectations or they exceed my expectations. And so knowing what I'm getting, like it felt really stable, predictable. I really enjoyed my time in Japan. So what can I say more about it? If you're impressed by quality, you might spend more. So I spent more in Japan on food than anywhere else I've been, not just because of cost, but because of the variety and the quality. And I felt like every time I was buying food, it was going to be a good experience. And so that's something to think about. If you end up really, really liking a given country that you go to, and many of you will find countries that you really, really enjoy that like really stick out to you, and the combination of factors there is thrilling and awesome. You may end up spending more than you anticipated. So you might have budgeted, I'm going to spend $2,000 this month in total when I include my flights, my accommodation, my restaurants, transportation. And then you might enjoy it so much you spend 20% more. Things just come up where you're trying fancy restaurants, and maybe you like to have a really nice gym membership that costs you about $100 US. These kinds of things can add up. So I guess what I'm trying to get across, don't assume that developing countries are always necessarily cheaper. In fact, in some cases, I spend more when I am traveling on various things just because I'm getting out more and doing more things, and the weather is more hospitable to what I want to do, and there's a variety of factors that go into that. But I definitely don't always spend less when I'm traveling abroad, but I tend to overall feel like I'm getting more for my money. Finally, why should you bring more money than, twice as much money and half the stuff? And I recognize many of these have been on why you should bring twice the money you think you'll need, but you'll feel better with a safety net in case unforeseen problems arise. So like, it's really nice in my mind knowing I didn't bring my high-end DSLR camera with me because I thought this is going to be an extra thing to keep up with. I've already got classes I'm working on. I've already got equities that I'm looking at every day. Do I really need my camera on top of my video equipment? And that's something nice that in my mind I'm thinking, well, if I lose all my gear I have with me, or I get robbed or things get stolen or whatever, at least when I go back to the States eventually, I'll have my DSLR I can start with. I've also got like a mic, so I'm not going to be totally without equipment. So as far as bringing like half the stuff, I brought like half the camera and audio gear I thought I'd need, but it turns out I'm making do with it. And if I need to add another piece or two, that may very well happen in the coming months. We'll see how things go. I'd kind of like to add an action cam to my setup, but we'll see how things go. Anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this video. This video I've described why I think you should bring twice the money and half the stuff when you are traveling. Try to pare down your stuff. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Are there any things that you brought with you on a recent trip? It's particularly a long-term trip where you're like, I wish I just left this thing at home. Or are there things that you didn't bring? Is there a really nice toothbrush you thought, I don't need it, I'll be gone for a month, I can make do with cheaper ones, and you ended up buying a copy of the nicer one once you got abroad because you felt like it was worth it? I'm kind of curious about what you have to think. Now, when it comes to money, how many of you, maybe there's some of you that wish you'd brought more money, and others of you that thought, man, I shouldn't have brought so much cash, or I shouldn't have brought so much money. I find myself like not spending a whole lot compared to what I thought I would. I prefer a simple lifestyle. So anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for subscribing. I can't believe we've passed 100 subscribers already. And take care. I'll see you next time.